All right, so we are going to go over, and it takes my face away. Well, you don't get to see my face. The Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention. So it's going to evaluate the failures of the Articles of Confederation and how it contributed to the principles of the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention, which is long-winded, but you guys did this already. So we're going to go over the Articles of Confederation. So it was written during the Revolutionary War. What they did was they looked at the Declaration and, they looked at the things that they did not like about how Britain ran it, and they, fixed it. So they gave National Congress limited power. So they gave the national government very limited power. They are allowed to control foreign affairs, to direct war, run the postal service, and control Indian affairs. Oh, and borrow money. But everything else was up to the states, and the states had individual control, so Massachusetts could do what they wanted, New York could do something completely different. Because of this, it was a disaster. It lasted until '89, so it lasted 12 years, but it was very apparent that it didn't work way before that. So why it didn't work was because the national government could not do a lot of things. They couldn't force people to obey laws. They couldn't tax people or states, so they weren't making money. We can't pay our debt that we're getting from the war. Couldn't establish a military. Couldn't regulate trade. And states also only had one vote regardless of population, so a large state like Virginia had the same amount of input as a small state of Rhode Island. It took 2/3 of states to pass any law, and it took all of the states to compromise to amend the Articles of Confederation, which trying to get 13 people to agree on anything is very hard to do. Each state had their own currency, and the currency in a different state was completely worthless. So if you went to Georgia from North Carolina, your money was worthless. They also did not have a president and no national court system. So basically, it was the United States of individual countries. They, weren't communicating. It's like a bad relationship. So then something called the Shays Rebellion happened. So Massachusetts decided to raise their taxes. Farmers were not pleased. They couldn't afford it, and if they couldn't afford the taxes, they went to jail or had their property taken away, which is not good. This led to mobs of violent farmers because Massachusetts is raising their taxes, but the other states aren't. And it also showed that the national government had no real power to intervene in the mob of violent farmers. Congress called for a convention to revise the articles. All the states but Rhode Island responded, going to Independence Hall in Philadelphia to start the Constitutional Convention in May of '87. So it does take 2 years for them to get the Constitution drafted. So this is where the Constitutional Convention comes into play, and we'll just briefly go over it before we get into the Constitution as a unit. So the Revolutionary War is over, we won, we have our freedom. States cannot decide what they want to do. They just know that the Articles of Confederation is a complete failure. The Founding Fathers aren't sure what kind of government they want. They didn't like Britain's monarchy. Obviously, the hands-off approach of national government is not going to work. People are becoming angry and rebelling against this brand new government. So at the Constitutional Convention, representatives start to draft a new document to replace the Articles of Confederation. So they kind of do what they did with the Declaration. So they looked at the Declaration, they said, all right, these are the things that we said we didn't want. We're going to put this into Articles of Confederation. So they're looking at the Articles of Confederation. All right, this is what didn't work. This is how we're going to change it. They wanted a strong government based off of, the weak government doesn't work. So the Constitution was signed in '87 and was sent to the states to be approved. In '89, I believe it was when it was put in place. So they had a few issues that we're going to talk about as far as going back and forth on what they wanted. First was representation. different states wanted representation to work differently. So remember, before it was one state, one vote. New Jersey came up with their plan and they said, this is what we should do. Each state gets equal representation, so they liked how it was going. New Jersey was small. This is why New Jersey had a small population, but they had equal voice to states like New York or Virginia. Virginia's like, whoa, that's not okay. We don't want this. Each state is represented based on population. So we're biggest, we want the most representatives. No, it doesn't have, well, anyway, they come up with a compromise. And it's Connecticut, I believe, that they're going to have bicameral legislation. So a legislature. So one will take the New Jersey plan and one will take the Virginia plan. What part of Congress is equal representation? And then what part of Congress is based on population? Next, we're going to go into slavery. So as of right now, slavery is legal in the United States. Southern states heavily relied on slavery for with their cotton and tobacco industries, free labor. Northern states, they didn't have a outright ban against slavery. There were, slaves in the northern states, but a lot of people were anti-slavery, and they also didn't have the type of not environment. What word am I trying to think of? Economy, like the South did. That's right. Yeah. How they had farming communities. The Northern was more industrial, so they didn't need slaves relied on to make their products. Their question was, do slaves count towards population and should they be taxed? The solution was that each slave will count as 3/5 of the person for representation. This solidifies the governmental thought on African Americans being lesser people, and it takes until the 1950s for government really to make it legally that they are equal rights. Still today we see discrimination, so it's a slow-moving process to change their minds. The northern states are happy because it's not as much as population as far as taxation and representation. And southern states are happy because they won't be taxed as much. Now, this is very cruel. To understand the minds of the 1700s and the founding fathers, they didn't believe that Africans were people. The southern states viewed them really as property, and the northern states probably didn't have much more of a fairer view. And then next they went to commerce and slave trade. So southern states didn't want the national government to interfere with business. They also were worried about the slave trade being outlawed. Northern states wanted them to pass laws to help with business because they are more of a business friendly area. So there's going to be more industrial factories and things like that. And so they also needed to decide what to do with runaway slaves. So they decided that Congress can regulate interstate and foreign commerce. They can tax imports, so the things we bring in, but they cannot tax exports, the stuff that we send out. They also put a ban on any legislation for the slave trade for 20 years. So it was kind of like, we're going to put this on pause for 20 years and we'll come back to it later. But you could tax the importation of slaves or enslaved people. And then fugitive or runaway slaves must be returned to their owners, which if they don't, then it is a crime against the people that are keeping them away from the Southerners or the captors. So this is, pretty awful to think about. So anybody who is harboring a runaway slave would face penalty of law or jail or whatever the fine may be. So the powers, the Articles of Confederation, the national government, again, had little control. People were afraid to get a national government again and having too much power to be controlled by a king. But they decide that it'll be shared. So the states have some power and the government has others. So tomorrow you will work on building your own constitution.